So firstly, we're going to take a look at this set of rules right here. So this set of rules is going to be very important in answering questions that are related to scientific notation. So there's two sets of rules that you're going to have to remember. And the first set of rules is if we're starting out, I'm going to put S in. So if we're starting out in scientific notation and we're going to decimal form. The other set of rules is if we're starting out in decimal form and we're going to turn it into scientific notation. So there's two different sets of rules, and we're just going to have to, all we have to know is that they're the opposites of each other. So what we do for one, we do the opposite if it's set up in the other direction. So the big important piece of information right here, this star right here is saying that we have to have one number in front of the decimal. So if we look at these proper forms of expanded notation, in front of the decimal, we have one number. And I'm not meaning the number 1, I'm meaning we have actually one digit in front of the decimal. We don't have two. We don't have two things in front of the decimal, like 21 point. It's just 1. So once again, that doesn't mean it needs to be the number 1. So if we look down at these examples right here, we see that the number's 3, but there's exactly one number in front of this decimal. Right here, the number is 4, but there's exactly one number in front of that decimal. Same thing for these problems, number 5 and number 6 down here. We have exactly one number in front of the decimal, and we have exactly one number in front of the decimal. So one more piece of information, the number in front of the decimal, it cannot be 0. So for instance, if you had 0.31, you can't do that. So the number has to be a number between 1 and 10. So it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but it can't be 0. So what we'd have to do is we'd actually have to move it over again so we have the number 3 in front of it. So big important piece of information so far is that 1, we need to make sure that we have exactly one digit in front of the decimal, and that digit cannot be 0. So now we're going to talk about the exponents. The way you know that it's already in scientific notation is because it's going to say times 10 and then an exponent. So if it's set up like that, it's in scientific notation. So here are the rules you need to memorize for if we're starting in scientific notation and going into decimal form. Exponent is positive, you're going to move it 3 spots to the right. If the exponent is negative, like it is in this one, you are going to move it 3 spots to the left. So here's our first number, 1.3 times 10 to the third. Alright, so once again, this positive 3 means we're going to move their decimal to the right. So in fact, if I rewrite it now, I'm actually going to move my decimal over 1 spot, over 2 spots, over 3 spots. And that's where my new decimal is going to go. So I'm going to fill in these blank spaces with zeros. And since there's nothing else behind the 0, or behind the decimal, that's it. I'm done. My number is going to be 1,300. So now I'm going to look at it the opposite way. Let's say I have 1.3 times 10 to the negative third. So once again, this is the rules for if we are going from scientific notation to decimal form. So if it's positive in scientific notation, you're going to move to the right. If it's negative in scientific notation, that means you're going to move it to the left. So we're going to go 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, and this is where our new decimal is going to go. So if we're writing it in the decimal form, I'm going to put 0, 0, filling in those blank spots with 0, 1, 3. And that would be this number in decimal form. So once again, if you are going from scientific notation to decimal form, if the number is positive, you're going to move it to the right. If the exponent is negative, you're going to move it to the left. So we're going to do another example. I'm just going to make up a number. We'll do 4.2 times 10 to the 5th power. So once again, notice I have exactly one number in front of the decimal because if it's in scientific notation already, that's how it has to be. So now I know I'm in scientific notation and I'm turning it into decimal form. So I know I'm going from scientific notation to decimal form. And in that way, I know if I have a positive exponent, I'm going to be moving my decimal to the right. So I'm going to be moving it 5 spots to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to fill in those spaces with zeros. And I know that this number in decimal form will actually be 420,000. Now I'm going to go ahead and do another example. So this example is going to be 3.059 times 10 to the negative 2. So once again, I'm starting in scientific notation and going into decimal form. So with that, I know if the exponent's positive, I'm going to the right. But in this case, since the exponent's negative, I'm going to be going to the left. So over 1, over 2 to the left. I'm going to put my decimal right here. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill in that blank spot. I'm going to get rid of these lines that I drew. I'm going to get rid of the times 10 to the negative 2 because that's what I'm doing when I move it over 2 decimal spaces to the left. And now I know that this is my number in decimal form, 0.03059. So next we're going to talk about what if we already have it in decimal form. and we're going to turn it into scientific notation. Now all we're going to do is switch the rules. So let's say we're starting. Now let's do another example where we're starting in decimal form, and let's say we have 325.12. So 325 and 1200ths. Where our first problem is, we have to get it, this is decimal form, and we have to get it into scientific notation. The big star said that we could only have one number in front of the decimal, but if we count, we have one number, two numbers, three numbers in front of the decimal. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to move the decimal to where there's only one number in front of the decimal. Okay, so now we're going to rewrite it. 3.25, and we move the decimal, so 3.2512 times 10. Now once again, let's count how many spaces we moved the decimal. We went over 1, over 2. So I know it's going to be a 2, but now we're going to look. Is this going to be positive or negative? So I'm looking at my rules from going from decimal form to scientific notation, and it says if I'm going to the left, my exponent's going to be positive. So I'm just going to leave that as a positive 2. And that would be my answer. So now we're going to do some problems that we can work on together. I'm going to ask you to solve them. You're going to put in the answer that shows you solved them on Edpuzzle, and then we're going to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and explain it. So we're going to do a little 4-problem exit ticket. So the first problem right here, what I want you to do is turn 4.2 times 10 to the 4th. So it's already in scientific notation. I want you to turn it into decimal form. So look at your notes, look at the rules for turning it from scientific notation into standard form. So what we're going to go ahead and do, if we're going scientific notation to standard form, if it's a positive exponent, that means we're going to move it to the right. So I'm going to rewrite my 4.2, and I know it starts right here, so I'm going to go over 1, over 2, over 3, over 4. I'm going to fill that in and erase my marks. So our correct answer should be 42,000. Okay, we're going to try another one. So now we have 3 and 1900ths times 10 to the negative third. This is the negative. So we already know it's in scientific notation, and we're turning it into decimal form. So if we're going from scientific notation to decimal form, and our exponent is a negative, that means we're going to move our decimal to the left. And how many spaces are we going to move it? We're going to move it 3. So over 1, over 2, over 3. Here's my decimal. In these blank spots, I'm going to go ahead and put a 0. And then decimal form doesn't have the times 10. And it doesn't have these little marks that I draw. So our final answer to number 2 would be 0.00319. So now we're going to try where we're going from decimal form to scientific notation. So the other way around. So we have 321 and 2600ths. So the first thing, I recognize that this is in decimal form because it doesn't say times 10 to the whatever power. and I realize that I have 1, 2, 3 numbers in front of the decimal. So let's go ahead and take a look at how many times we need to move it to get exactly 1 number in front of the decimal. Well, I need to move it over 1, over 2 spaces to the left. So I'm going to rewrite this. 3.2126. And I know I'm going to put times 10. And I know that I moved it 2 spaces, so I know the exponent has to be 2. I just got to figure out, is it going to be a positive or a negative exponent? So once again, I'm going back, I'm looking at my rules. I see that if I am going from decimal form to scientific notation, and if I'm going to the left, it is going to be a positive exponent. So I'll just leave it as 2. Now we're going to do another example. And we're going to start with decimal form. Let's start with 0.043. So in this case, once again, I don't see the times 10 to the whatever power, and also I don't see any numbers in front of the decimal. We're going to go from decimal form to scientific notation. And so once again, we have to have 1 number in front of the decimal. Now, that number has to have a certain value. That number has to be between 1 and 10. So if I stop right here, I will have 1 number in front of the decimal. But that number is 0, and that won't be between 1 and 10. So I actually have to move it over a second space. So now the number that's in front of the 0 is between 1 and 10. So once again, I'm going to rewrite it. I have 4.3 times 10. I see that I moved it over 1 space, 2 spaces. And because I'm going from decimal form to scientific notation and I went to the right, that means I have a negative exponent. So one more time, the big important piece of information here is that you need to move it over 1, 2 spaces in this one because the number that's in front of the decimal has to be between 1 and 0, or 1 and 10, and 0 is not between 1 and 10. So lastly, I'm going to give you one more problem that we're going to look at, and it's just going to be a problem that I want you guys to think about for a second. So here's our next and final problem I want us to take a look at. And my question is, two of these answer choices are not in proper scientific notation. I want you to select the 2 answer choices that are not in proper scientific notation. So you should see on answer choice C, we have 2 numbers in front of the decimal. So that is why answer choice C is not in scientific notation. And in answer choice D, although we do have a number in front of the decimal, it is not between 1 and 10. So we can't have a 0 in front of the decimal. So D is also wrong.